Hello everyone, Ruby Ravel here. I have recently emancipated myself from a psychic high security prison of the highest order, just in time to do a video for you about Saturn's ingress into Pisces and those bizarre waters of the unlived self. Now, Saturn is all about the walls we build around ourselves and why. In a naturally dangerous world full of many bizarre vagaries and vicissitudes, it is necessary that we armor and protect ourselves from potential dangers. But as well as being finite beings with a finite amount of lifespan, if we allow ourselves to be always seduced by all the infinite variables and different ways in which we could present ourselves, we'll never get anything done. So Saturn, to make the job a bit easier for us, gives us limits. He gives us limitations that we can build around ourselves to give us a sense of shape and structure. So we can say that all that is contained within these barriers is myself, and everything that extends beyond these barriers is not myself. He can map out what we have explored and choose to continue to explore and refine and enhance, and what we have decided it is best for us to leave untapped and unresearched. The problem with this methodology, while practically sound in theory, is that it can cause us to shut off from whole arenas and avenues of life for relatively arbitrary reasons. Sometimes if we've experienced a trauma or a personal injury, a humiliation, some kind of prolonged embarrassment in a particular area of life, we can decide that we are going to close the door on it. Because we did not achieve instant success, or because we experienced the scorn and the contempt of an uncaring collective, we say, that part of life is not for me. I am naturally handicapped in that area, and it is better off that I have nothing to do with it whatsoever. When I tried in the past, bad things happened to me, and I'm sure if I try again, even worse things will happen. So I will stay in the areas of my strength. I will continue to stroll down the boulevards where I can experience a sense of superiority, but anything that makes me feel weak and afraid and scared and lesser than others is best avoided completely. But when we have committed to a vision of ourselves as being permanently weak, unskilled, and untutored and untutorable in a given area, we find ourselves with this glaring blind spot where we can easily become dependent on other people who possess the might and wisdom that we lack in a given area. If we build up these high security walls around a given part of ourselves, and that part of ourselves' relationship to a particular arena of existence, we can also be shutting out the flow of life, obstructing a form of nourishment that we may deeply crave, but because we have decided that we cannot fulfill it or give it to ourselves, or even permit ourselves to receive it from someone else, then we will build this solid iron wall that will always act as a shutter, keeping it out. But then that part of us that remains untouched by the warm fingers of life becomes brooding, it becomes grumpy, it becomes sultry. And any time in which we enter a period of our life where we are confronted with that deficit and inadequacy in ourselves, we end up responding in a maladaptive way to protect our own shame. Very often when we are confronted with the things that we aren't able to do, we build up all these complex defense mechanisms around it. We become angry, we become superior, we become supercilious, we dismiss anyone who has anything to do with that part of life because we don't want to expose the fact that we feel inadequate there. So when Saturn is transiting a given sign or a house, he asks us to examine our relationship with that life, to see if we have built too harsh a structure or defensive mechanism against something that we actually need. And if it turns out we have completely dammed up the flow of a given tide in an area of life, then Saturn says we need to do something about this, because otherwise this will be a spot where we will forever be vulnerable and easily exploited and manipulated by others who possess this ability that we lack. He says we need to put in the hard work here to face our fears so that we can become a more wholly rounded individual who knows that they have accumulated the thick skin that will enable them to deal with this particular area of life. The odd thing about Saturn in Pisces is that we are being asked to school ourselves in an area of life in which rules, regulations, structures, and neat delineations separating one thing from another, all those fastidious things that Saturn usually loves and employs as a crutch in order to give himself a sense of having a grasp on life, no longer apply. Even concepts like time and space suddenly become mutable, elastic, and rather illusory. On the map of the zodiac, then Pisces and the 12th house is the area where things are still left in shadow. It's the part that is guarded by all kinds of taboos and fables and mysteries and legends that all say, do not go here, for this is where the mystery of the unlived self lives. Now, the imagery that I normally associate with Saturn's process is the architectural endeavor to build this strong fortress, this big stony edifice that can defend itself and which is capable of lasting for generations and generations. But that kind of edifice won't really hold its own weight in the waters of Pisces, where everything is mutable, where everything is always changing, where what is unknown far exceeds what is possibly known, and the only strength we can possibly have is by learning to surrender and trust in the process of that unknown and find some kind of love and mysterious numinous relationship with it. Here, the fortress we are building has to be capable of sailing not just upon the waves, but also like a submarine, able to dive far beneath them and still hold its own in those bizarre, dizzying depths. Now, people with Saturn in Pisces natally, or often indeed in any watery element, are typically afraid of the depths of their own emotions and the capacity of those emotions to erode our sense of self-control. There are many surface emotions that we can all deal with on a day-to-day level, and yet there are some that are the size of Leviathan, that are as big as blue whales, that seem to be these oceanic beasts surfacing from other worlds that in a heartbeat can suddenly eradicate and throw into bewilderment everything we ever thought we knew about ourselves. This is what happens when we have those envoys from our unconscious mind suddenly erupt unawares on our day-to-day physical existence. In a single moment, a mystical experience can challenge everything that we believed about our reality. A single overwhelming emotion that overtakes us and forces us to behave in erratic, unusual, and hypersensitive ways can very quickly deluge all the existing structures that we have built around ourselves to give us a sense of solidity in the world. I think probably one of the most potent of these is when we experience love for someone that seems to defy all logic and rationale. We cannot choose who we love or whom we are attracted to. And yet all of us will have experienced at some point in our lives being entranced and enchanted by someone in ways that don't seem to make sense. The person we are attracted to may even be someone who is completely different from our usual type. And yet every time we are with them, every time we are in their presence, suddenly all this strange longing and yearning overtakes us that no matter how we try, we cannot subdue. In fact, the more we try and push down those feelings, the stronger the repulsive force of them becomes until it seems to devour our every waking moment. So the biggest fear of Saturn in Pisces is that we could feel a love, a compassion, a yearning, a desire, a numinous thirst that is so strong that it makes us willing to sacrifice everything: our self-esteem, our self-worth, our self-survival mechanisms, everything that we normally do to preserve ourselves and keep ourselves solid intact. We are willing to surrender control of, all in the hopes of merging completely with this divine other that we are longing to have some kind of fusion with. If we love someone deeply and overwhelmingly enough with that kind of divine compassion, we truly feel like we would do anything for them, that we would sacrifice our life for them. And Saturn in Pisces is terrified of the dangers and pitfalls of that kind of vulnerability. If we love something that much, the thing we are giving our love to could easily exploit that love. It could abuse us mercilessly. It could put us in situations where we basically end up becoming imprisoned because we are a plaything, a mere object in the eyes of our beloved. Now, in order to avoid feeling this kind of vulnerability or helplessness or emotional exploitation, Saturn in Pisces has to build incredibly thick walls indeed. Anytime anything seems to bring up deep emotions or feelings that are threatening to take one too far into oneself, Saturn in Pisces people will often respond by running away, by withdrawing, by running to the hills at the slightest notion that things are going to start to get deep. It will try and maintain a surface or light or trivial attitude towards everything, precisely so that those deeper cues of vulnerability are not triggered. And yet, at the same time, Saturn actually has a deep longing for exactly the thing that it is avoiding. It might be seeming to do everything in its power to shut off any experiences of the divine, of the mysterious, of the numinous, of the strange, of any kind of exalted love or suffering that seems to be able to create this total crucifixion of the existing self. And yet at the same time, it wants it. It feels the malnourishment, the spiritual malnourishment and longing that comes from feeling that there is not fantasy in life, that everything has become disenchanted, and it longs for that magic at the same time that it says that magic is impossible and could not exist. And so it's not unusual, I find, for people with Saturn in Pisces to actually spend a lot of time investigating mysterious things. They may decide to approach spirituality, mysticism, the occult, cryptozoology, Jungian psychology through this kind of very rigorous and intellectual lens, but all as a means of using that pseudo-scholarly approach of keeping any direct involvement with it at bay. It's almost like Saturn in Pisces is in this submarine, peering out at the waters and examining it and going, "Ooh, that's very interesting. I better write that down and put that in my tables and graphs and pie charts." But it is doing everything in its power to avoid getting wet, to avoid being touched. It may write a scholarly thesis on UFO abductees and yet do everything in its power to make sure it has no experiences of aliens or extraterrestrials itself. It will go to some indigenous community and study the shamans there, but also make sure that in any of its write-ups, it is treating shamanism as being a silly thing that could never actually be an experience that could occur to a sensible, rational, intellectual person in the modern Western world. And yet what Saturn in Pisces really needs to do is to leave the fucking submarine. It needs to let go of all these rigorous, rational barriers and constructs that preserve its self-control and dive into those waters. It needs to learn to experience helplessness and realize that a huge amount of fulfillment can come from learning to surrender control. Saturn in Pisces is terrified of emotional chaos. It is afraid of anything that can flood its sensual and experiential system. And yet it needs to have that experience at that same time in order to be a deeper person. Otherwise, there will always be a part of it that will be left dry and untouched. So the ultimate lesson of Saturn in Pisces is to learn to surrender, to let go of discipline, to let go of structures, to let go of all pre-existent safety nets, to let go of all previously constructed paradigms of knowledge and say, you know what? All of this could be wrong. All of this could just be a barricade, a horrible net of thorns and wires that is preventing me from experiencing the deepest part of myself, that is preventing me from really being truly vulnerable and intimate and emotionally present with other people. If I really want to have that psychic interface with someone else where the boundaries between me and them disappear completely, then I have to be willing to admit that I may have been wrong about everything. Reality may not be as I previously felt it to be. And the challenge of Saturn in any placement is that we may become an expert, a professor, a true guide and psychopomp in an area we previously neglected because we've had to put so much effort into building that spiritual musculature, into really understanding something which for the longest of time felt so alien and incomprehensible to us. We then know how to teach and communicate that to other people. I can say that there is some truth in that in my own self, in that even though I have Saturn in Capricorn, it's also in the 12th house, which resonates with Pisces. And there have definitely been many times in my life where I have built up very elaborate structures to avoid any kind of loss of self-control, and yet found that the more I committed to those disciplines of self-control, the more I felt myself completely isolated from the rest of life. I had put myself in this position of exile because I didn't want to risk being rejected by the collective. And yet the way I did that was by rejecting myself from the collective or believing I had anything to do with them. And only by letting go of that and being willing to participate in the great human drama of life, did I really begin to have any sense that I was living at all. And that's the wonderful thing when we can use Saturn as a schoolmaster who says this is something you've left unexplored, which you need to explore, rather than using him as a dam to keep back an area of life. Once we let that dam go, we can suddenly feel things flow and move in a way they never have before, that opens up whole areas of life that we never thought would be possible, which we always felt would be denied us. And that can be a very nourishing and wonderful experience indeed. You know, sometimes these things have to begin as a shock. It's a bit like when you have someone who has this very nuts and bolt physical view of reality in which there is no enchantment, in which there is no mystery, and suddenly one day while they're walking the dog, they see a UFO, or they see Bigfoot, or they see an angel, or they see an apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and the experience is so powerful, so deep, so earth-shattering, and so undeniably visceral on an experiential level that they can't say no to it. They can't rationalize it away, and suddenly they find, I have to reconstruct my whole view of how reality works at all. And while that can be traumatic at first, because you suddenly feel like you're a crazy person, that you are one of those people that you've spent so much of your life mocking as being gullible and naive drug takers, in the end, you can find yourself enriched and baptized in a deeper reality that makes you able to feel more deeply interfused than you ever believed was possible, to feel a magic that you thought only existed in fairy tales and fantasy fiction, and which now is your whole existence. Anyway, I'm going to stop it there. The siren of the subconscious has to know her own limits. Not everyone will experience this in the same way. For some people, it may just be an opportunity to dig deeper into those Neptunian waters that they may already be very comfortable with. For people who are afraid of this area, it may be a very challenging time indeed, and I'm sure I can explore that in depth in future videos. If you have your own stories that you would like to share, or your own Saturn in Pisces experiences, please leave them in the comment below. It's always lovely to chat to you. If you would like any spiritual counseling, help, or advice, my contact details will be below as well. And if you want to support me on Patreon, that will also be linked below as well. And all my love to you as you go sailing into the bizarre waters of the beyond.